So I'm a landscape photographer, and when I say that, I mean something really specific. So I'm going to try to give you a definition here. So I think of landscape as space that's given context and meaning by human activity. Space doesn't have any meaning on its own until we give it meaning, until we experience things in that space. Then it's a landscape. So even in what you can think of as traditional landscape photography, the photographers are attaching their own values to what they're photographing. They're trying to convey their own message. So, for example, Ansel Adams, he was a member of the Sierra Club, so through his photographs, he tried to express values about the preservation of the wilderness. Ansel Adams has certainly had some influence on me. I call this one Moonrise over Storage Tanks. So, as a landscape photographer, I'm interested in exploring not just aesthetic beauty and what I see, but also the meanings and the values that we try to embed in the landscape around us. There's a variety of photographers, including some who've shown at this museum, Robert Adams, who explore the exploitation and the ruin of natural space, especially by extractive industry. But what do we do with that space after that? Once we've clear cut the forest, what do we build there? What's the significance of what we build there? So that's one of the more specific questions I try to ask. How do the spaces that we've shaped then shape us? And how do they shape our experience of them? And that's where I think you can see evidence of what our culture is. So as an electrical engineer by training, I'm fascinated by electrical infrastructure. More than a century of engineering has gone into creating the modern electrical grid. Billions, probably trillions of man hours have gone into designing and building it, and there's a reason for every component to be where it is, even this. All of our modern conveniences, from our cell phones, the projector showing you this presentation, they're all possible because of the electrical infrastructure. And yet, it's so easy to take for granted where it is, what it looks like, what it does for us. Some of how these substations are laid out is because of practical concerns. You know, there's a minimum space required for a transformer of a given size. There has to be a separation between the higher voltage part and the lower voltage part. There's also a question of how much space you have in a city to accomplish the role of the substation. But other parts are because of aesthetic concerns. So maybe a substation like this would look even more out of place without the intervention of the shrubbery. Maybe we want to make substations feel like they're more part of their surroundings. Or maybe we want to hide this infrastructure entirely. But maybe we want to forget about them. But our dependence as a society on the electricity that these power lines convey mean that ultimately major elements of our landscape are centered on production and transmission and consumption of electricity. This is especially true in the Pacific Northwest, where the Pacific Northwest has only been able to develop the way that it has because of the Bonneville Dam, because of the dams that provide a lot of power to the cities. Hydroelectric power has been indirectly responsible for the fourfold increase in the population of Oregon from 1937, when the Bonneville Dam was built, all the way to now. And all of the infrastructure that supports that increase in population. A less positive aspect of the ready availability of energy is the amount of electricity that's used for the sole purpose of encouraging us to consume more electricity. And when I say that, I mean, of course, advertising. And again, that's an expression of our values in this capitalist consumerist culture. Even after everybody goes to sleep, it's 2 a.m., there's nobody around to see this brightly lit advertising. But it's still there. It's spilling out tons and tons of light. It's using tons and tons of energy, and still we take it for granted. But even in what I see as wastefulness, there's an aesthetic quality that I appreciate. There's a beauty in the way that the light falls out from the sources of light onto the landscape around it and shapes it. Every category of advertising has its tropes, and I find an examination of these tropes worthwhile. It tells us a lot. Awnings on buildings are a good example. They almost always have the same shape. They're almost always red or yellow. Light spills out of them in the exact same shapes. There's an incredible degree of conformity from one to the next. I'm not an awnings engineer, so I don't know how much of how they look is because they need to be that way, how much is because that's what's most effective. But I do appreciate even these little subtle things. There's other kinds of nighttime advertising too, although they're not all equally effective since Ragtooth is closed now. In Mount Angel, Oregon, where having German-style anything might be an enticement for selling to the people that visit Mount Angel. You might see something like this very common in the window. Now, if you were actually in Germany, it might be a little weird because that font is associated with Nazism. The profusion of light is not just for commercial buildings, of course. Another of my personal favorite forms of nighttime advertising is neon. So here the owners of the Santa Monica Court, they clearly think that this neon and probably also the palm trees are going to make their residents feel like they're in Southern California. So like the awnings, neon casts a particular kind of glow on everything around it. And it's almost like a faucet pouring out these puddles of neon light. So far, I haven't talked at all about the technical aspects of how I take photographs, and that's completely intentional. Because I might have a certain way of doing things, a certain way of making a picture, I use certain equipment, but that's not why I take the photo. It's not about that process. It's about the meaning of what I'm trying to convey, and it's about the results I get. It just so happens that I like the results I get using large format color negative film. Large format photography really forces me to slow down and carefully consider each and every photograph before I take it, sometimes a lot before. It forces me to carefully consider the framing of each shot, the exposure of each shot. It's not that I can't do that with a digital camera or a smaller camera. It's just that I don't have any choice when I use this camera. There's one thing in particular that negative film does much better than any other kind of photographic medium. And the reason I use it, especially for night photography, is because past a certain point, film stops responding to more light. So you get a very gentle fall off. You don't get blown highlights, and it more accurately represents, I think, how we see things at night. So for me, this means I can convey not just what I see, but how I feel when I take that picture. On the topic of seeing, my approach to composition was, I think, best described by another one of my photographic influences, Stephen Shore. He said that composition can be modeled as sort of being in a blackened room, no lights on, and a flashlight that projects a rectangle of light. I try to think of my rectangular frame like I think of poetry. There shouldn't be any visual element that doesn't serve a purpose in the poem I'm telling with my photograph. I'm also very conscious of the photograph as a two-dimensional object. And as a result, like Shore, I try to pay very close attention to what's going on at the edges and the corners of my photographs. So another, maybe more specific category of landscapes I've been cataloging recently is Chinese restaurants. Chinese restaurants have been a thing in America for over 150 years at this point. And it's long enough that they've become a part of the landscape across America. They're taken for granted. You can find a Chinese restaurant on pretty much any main street anywhere in America. And in a lot of ways, they've absorbed patterns from other parts of the American landscape. For example, neon, the awnings, all sorts of little things that we pick up from the culture. But they have their own patterns too. Patterns that, like Chinese food itself, are unique and also a product of the surrounding landscape. So in my desire to explore and enumerate these patterns, I share a creative impulse with another of my photographic influences, that'd be Bernd and Hilla Becher. So like them, I see motifs in a family of objects that together make up a total of an archetype. But my work is also a reaction to the Bechers, because they were more interested in formalism, and I think in examining the structures themselves and building that archetype rather than in examining the things that historians or sociologists might. So one effect of the Becher's presentation of their subjects is that it anonymizes any individual, and any individual that's in a given category. And I'm not interested in doing that. I want to look at these subjects anthropologically. I want to uncover what makes each of these individuals unique and what that tells us about the culture. It's not just the existence and the description of these restaurants that makes me interested in them. I am doing what could be considered typology, like the Bechers, classifying landscapes by their physical characteristics, like Chinese restaurants. For me, though, the reason to build these typologies is that by examining the permutations within these categories, we can see beauty, we can see meaning. The marriage of functionality and aesthetics is worth looking at, and in particular, I want to look at the ways each subject deviates from the average of its category. The variety of human expression, even within these limited categories, is a metaphor for my own artistic goals. I'm trying to express myself as fully and as clearly as I can, even as I constrain myself by photographing only these certain subjects. So I'd like to extend my earlier comparison between photography and poetry by saying that you might think of it as my having chosen a particular meter for my poems. It's also my hope that by photographing and closely examining these often overlooked landscapes, we can appreciate them more fully and experience them more richly. Another kind of landscape that can be taken too much for granted, I think, is the tourist or the sightseeing landscape. So these tourists are certainly taking the sea lions for granted. We create these special constrained spaces through which tourists can have a certain experience of the environment. In a lot of cases, that's because we want to prevent damage to the environment so that more people can experience it and enjoy it. A lot of cases, that's because we want to prevent harm to the people enjoying that landscape. On the other hand, sometimes that means a space is given meaning just by virtue of having been set aside. So in this example, the view that this area was constructed for is like 90 degrees off to the left. It's unrelated to what these people are seeing. But the construction, the way that this space is built, gives that view in that direction some significance. Even when tourists are observing or participating in another culture's religious rites, you have separate spaces created for them. These tourists are in the middle of a town square. They're surrounded by a circle of people who are singing and dancing to celebrate the Ethiopian Orthodox Epiphany. But being there and documenting it for themselves is as important to the tourists as Epiphany is to the people celebrating. Tourists have their own rites and customs, and one of the most important ones is the photographic proof of presence. You can easily imagine that everybody in this photo has a different reason for recording their presence or recording someone else's presence. So in this way, people record their own meanings that are attached to a landscape. My own habit when I'm a tourist at this point is to record other people recording their experiences. It's a ritual where it doesn't matter how many photos have been taken in any given place. It doesn't matter how good the other photos are. Those people have to have their own photo. We see this in places like the Portland Japanese Garden. The maple there is probably the most photographed tree in the Pacific Northwest, and still there's more photos. This particular form of self-documentation has caused some consternation, but it's really, again, just another way of recording the meanings that people attach to a place and the way in which they form a personal connection to that landscape. I love going there just to take pictures of people. Another form of transportation that has also caused consternation But again, it's just a different way that people traverse space. Sometimes the original meanings of a space, are replaced entirely. So Red Rocks Amphitheater outside Denver, it used to be a favorite campsite of the Ute people, and now it's a concert venue. Even in landscapes that are specifically set aside for preservation, we tolerate a certain amount of human presence. And how much we tolerate varies a lot. Here, it's a relatively dramatic reshaping. This hole was cut for tourists to be able to hike through the canyon. This is Bryce Canyon. Sometimes it's a little more subtle. Sometimes the human footprint becomes literally part of the landscape. This is a steam vent in Iceland, and people would just walk right up to it. Sometimes the human footprint is a less literal part of the landscape. So to the tourists that came to the Ethiopian desert, it took 4 days to get here. But this isn't the most visually appealing part of the landscape. So it becomes literally a trash fire. And then again, sometimes it's a more minimal touch. This is a place where you take a boat up to the glacier and you can see icebergs calving, but you don't go on the glacier. You don't experience them in the same direct way. In the form of a road, the human footprint can make a landscape a space that's only meant to be driven through. And that's actually one of the big reasons I try to stop and get out once in a while when I'm on a road trip. This is a landscape you might otherwise only see from behind your steering wheel. But in any case, the experience of these landscapes can be every bit as constructed as the landscape that you see in the city. That could be for preservation, or it could be a matter of, again, convenience or safety. So this is, again, Iceland, where it's culturally part of Europe, so the attitudes towards safety and personal responsibility are a little bit different. Recently we had somebody in Yellowstone fall into the hot springs and they died. But how we handle the circumstance of such a possibility tells you a lot about what our values are. Are they things like safety, personal responsibility, protection from liability, freedom? So as a group, humans have had a lot of practice shaping the world around us. Not that we can always keep things a certain way. This is a 200-ton obelisk that fell down almost immediately after it was erected. But you can see that it's been built around in such a way that people can still experience it. Tourists can walk under it. Landscapes of the extractive industries I mentioned are also constructed with certain values, but it tends to be profit motive that's most paramount. Sometimes it's high tech, sometimes it's low tech, but it's all about getting the most resources for the least money. It's not to say that there isn't beauty to be found in the exploitation of the earth, of course. Sometimes, I know it can be a cliched sentiment, but sometimes I just want to take a beautiful photo. Sometimes I appreciate a good joke. Sometimes I want to imagine the hidden story a landscape could tell. What happened here? Sometimes the earth gets the better of us, and the landscapes that we end up constructing are reactive, such as this one. It's a dam that holds back the flow of sediment that's left over from the Mount St. Helens eruption. I want to know what this is a reaction to. Is it part of the purpose, part of the goals of preservation of the national park it's in? Is the placement intentional? Is it just trash? One end of the pipe is open, but the other one goes into the earth. Is it going anywhere? Who knows? Sometimes conservation can look like an extreme measure, but that's in proportion to the meaning that people place in these landscapes. This church was carved out of the rock 1,000 years ago, maybe more. But without the canopy that was erected to protect it, it would be at risk for continued erosion. So there is a lot of meanings and a lot of values in this landscape. Last category of landscapes I want to talk about, and I've been looking at, is maybe the most specific one. It's apartment buildings in Portland. So there's been a lot of hand-wringing in Portland over the last few years about all the new apartment buildings going up and replacing older buildings, replacing things that people know and love. I hear these new buildings being derided as cubic steel and glass monstrosities, and that we're losing things that we should preserve. But if we're going to say that, we should actually look critically at what the older generation of apartment buildings looks like. So initially, this project started when I noticed that a lot of the apartments in my neighborhood in inner northeast Portland, they're all managed by one company, American Property Management. They all have the exact same style of sign. So I set out to see if I could catalog them all. Since a lot of the buildings the names of the buildings share a first letter with the street that they're on, I thought maybe I could make an alphabet, go from A to Z, but unfortunately not. I don't think we have a Z alphabet street. But in doing so, and in talking to my friends about housing in Portland, I came to realize how similar a lot of these buildings are, and at the same time, how they inspire indifference at best. One of the great things about Portland is the access to open data about the city. So I sat down and I started looking at the data. I saw that all of these older buildings I'm showing you at the moment are from the wave of development that crested in the early 70s. Completely separate buildings. So this is not the first time that there's been a huge amount of new, similar-looking apartment buildings being constructed all at the same time. And there's nothing unique about what's happening right now other than that the newest buildings have their own particular style. Every building boom has its own dominant architectural style. Once you see the same design patterns over and over again, it's easy to notice and appreciate the subtle differences between the otherwise very similar members of a contemporary group of apartment buildings. Now, there's still a lot of pre-World War II buildings, and they were built over the longest. The ones that still exist, at least, were built over a long period of time, but they also share a lot of traits with each other. Within a group of buildings, it's the little details, the flourishes, the details that distinguish them from each other. Both the differences between the buildings and the similarities can express values. The other thing we can do if we look at a cross-section of Portland apartment buildings, is we can notice how priorities change over time. So the buildings that were built in the 60s and 70s, they're all arranged around parking. In this case, the apartment is over the parking. Sometimes it's built around the central courtyard of parking. Sometimes the entire front half of the property is parking. But in any case, the car is central. And this is an apartment that's less than 2 miles from downtown. Also less than 2 miles from downtown is this much newer building. So its footprint is laid out with the assumption that, or the hope that people are going to be using public transit, walking, biking. Of course, it doesn't always work out that way, and we end up with neighborhoods very hard to park in. So another contrast that you see when comparing older and newer buildings is the number and direction of the windows and doors. And I think that's spurred by the ready availability of metal framed, double pane windows because they much more easily keep out noise, street noise. So newer buildings are going to face more to their surroundings. And older buildings like this one tuck their entryways and their windows out of the way. They're facing towards other buildings, they're facing towards smaller streets or inwards towards themselves. And that has a real effect on how people interact with these buildings and how the tenants interact with the space outside their buildings. So I think when we worry about where all the people moving to Portland are going to live, who's going to be gentrified, it's important to remember that in 40 years, all of these new buildings are going to occupy the same role that what is now 40 years old occupies. And we mostly ignore those older buildings, but they do shape a lot of how we interact with the urban space around us. So what's now upscale is going to become mid-scale. We know that the demand is going to increase, but I think that means that we can't avoid creating more housing supply lest we drive up prices and demand for the existing housing stock, and thereby making the problem of gentrification even worse. So since we're in the midst of another building boom, we should be asking ourselves, do the landscapes that these new buildings form reflect what we want our values to be right now? Do they reflect what we want our values to be in 40 years? And that's the kind of question I try to ask with my photography. That's it.